With the dawn of the Switch 2 era, I have seen an increasing trend of people worrying that Nintendo has abandoned its tradition of innovation, that from now on we are in the era of safety first Nintendo consoles. Although I definitely think there are some aspects to consider about Nintendo's appetite for risk as it stands, I thought it might be worth reviewing the history of Nintendo's home, handheld, and hybrid consoles to rank the systems from the least to the most innovative. I have been a little selective about the consoles I've included, and so less widely released consoles like the Satellaview and the 64DD do not feature, nor do adapters like the Super Game Boy, revisions like the DSi or the 2DS XL, or, and this is the one I thought about the hardest, single-use machines like the Color Game TV series and the Game and Watch consoles. I actually think there's a case that if you include Game & Watch, it absolutely storms the list above almost anything else, but I'm limiting this to widely available platforms Nintendo produced which play multiple games. That means in handhelds we have the Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, the Virtual Boy, the Game Boy Advance, the DS, and the 3DS. In consoles, we have the NES, Super NES, Nintendo 64, GameCube, Wii, and Wii U, and now we have the Switch and Switch 2 as the hybrid systems. 14 consoles in the running, and I'm going to go in reverse order. To be clear, this is strictly about innovation. I am not ranking them by any other metric. Not the games, not the power, not how much I personally like them. Since this is quite a nostalgic exercise, I probably won't avoid talking about all that, but basically the key aspect to consider with these listings is how innovative is it? All that said, the list is clearly going to be subjective to some degree, as it's likely impossible to really come up with a truly objective measure of innovation. So, without further ado, let's start with number 14, Game Boy Advance. I really like the Game Boy Advance, but it was never exactly a handheld that could be called truly innovative. With advances like shoulder buttons and better graphics, it was an upgrade of the original Game Boy, which was still a powerhouse after 12 years. There were facilities to link to other consoles as well, not just the Game Boy link cables resuscitated, but the Game Boy Advances could be plugged into the GameCube for a game experience presaging the DS with some use of multi-screen abilities. That was, I guess, kind of innovative, but I think it has to be said that there really wasn't anything about the Game Boy Advance that electrified the future of gaming, and so I'm afraid it takes the bottom of the list. Number 13, Game Boy Color. What can be said about the Game Boy Color? Many don't even consider it a generation in its own right, but rather a sort of mid-gen refresh of the Game Boy, if you can call a new iteration of a 9-year-old console mid-gen. However, while there may be good technological reasons for it to be considered as such, to me, the humble Game Boy Color was a thing of wonder. For so long in the 90s, the eternal whisper was when there would be a color Game Boy. Sega had done it at the beginning of the decade, but while the Game Gear was a lovely machine, it was incredibly battery hungry, and frankly, the games library was not a patch on Nintendo's. The Super Game Boy add-on to allow Game Boy games to be played in color on the SNES was a tease. By the time 1998 rolled around, it had frankly stopped even seeming like a possibility. The Game Boy was just one of those eternal monoliths that never really change, however much the world around it does. And yet, when the Game Boy Color appeared, it was a truly magical device. It wasn't only thinner and lighter, but the games were given new colors. I think this aspect of it is underrated, but I remember being slightly amazed at how games released years and years before, not even just the ones since the Super Game Boy, were now given colors that usually looked pretty good. Certainly it was surprising enough that I think it deserves to be just a tiny notch higher than the Game Boy Advance when it comes to innovation. The Game Boy Color is an example of what happens when you give the customers exactly what they've been dying for years, and although it was short-lived, I absolutely love this system. So what if it's not the biggest leap ever? If the next step is that obvious, it would be pure obstinacy to do anything different. Okay, I think these two are fairly uncontroversial, but let's move on to number 12, the Super NES. Okay, the days of 16-bit gaming were glorious indeed, and so many absolutely incredible series hit their 2D perfection in this era, but these are feats of graphical power. How else were Nintendo innovating? Well, what's usually pointed to, including by Nintendo themselves, is the emergence of the shoulder buttons. Increased numbers of buttons in controllers wasn't new. The Sega Mega Drive had already tried 3 buttons, and there was a little bit of an arms race at the time between Sega and Nintendo, with the Sonic creators coming out with a 6 button controller for the Mega Drive in 1993, and then in 1995 adding additional shoulder buttons to the Sega Saturn for an 8 button experience. But Nintendo score a win here because the ergonomic placement on the shoulders stood the test of time, and every console since has employed shoulder buttons in some form. On the other hand, you might think, so what? But while it's easy to think obvious ideas were obvious with the benefit of hindsight, the fact is that Nintendo led this innovation, something that previous people had not thought of. Another aspect worthy of some note, although it seems unremarkable in retrospect, was the 4-color button scheme. It was perhaps inevitable that as buttons became more numerous, different ways to remember and identify them would be needed, lest the system require a whole alphabet of letters to label the buttons with. Bringing coloured letters to the controller was a flourish of ambition and still an attempt to be different. And yet, fundamentally, the Super NES is, down to its name, an iterative console, and I can't see cause for it to place any higher. Next we have number 11, GameCube. Okay, I know this will be a controversial one, but GameCube is an odd console for Nintendo in a lot of ways. The belated move to disc technology seems like very much an admission that their tactic of sticking with cartridges into the N64 era had failed, but they couldn't yet go over to standard size CDs as they would eventually see they needed to do with the Wii and Wii U. Perhaps conscious of cost and space savings, perhaps simply wanting their machine to look distinctive, they instead used mini CDs, which effectively brought a taste of the biggest issues of cartridges over to mini discs, their limited storage space, while keeping all the problems of CDs, such as their vulnerability to scratches and their longer loading times. It was an innovation, sure, but one that seemed strangely pointless, especially as mini discs had failed to really capture the public imagination even by 2001, like full-size CDs had done previously. Sure, it was the first Nintendo console to move into optical media, apart from the 64DD, but the Saturn and PlayStation had got there more than half a decade earlier. It was the last console to be explicitly in the power arms race, partly because it positioned itself a little after the release of the PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast, and only a couple of months prior to the first Xbox. But I don't think just juicing the console shows innovation by itself. The biggest area of innovation for GameCube was really in the controller. The button layout was new and improved and still stands the test of time today in many respects. The dual analog sticks emulated the PlayStation's 1997 controller. The analog triggers had already been piloted by Sega for the analog controller that they bundled with Nights into Dreams. Technologically, the GameCube felt like they really wanted to find an answer to all the features that were popular elsewhere, and yet this didn't leave much room for a truly Nintendo-ish departures, rather a Nintendo-like gloss on things that already existed in the marketplace. I mean, there is a handle though, and the Game Boy Advance integration was a fun gimmick, but not something anybody I knew ever actually used. Another problem is that while the GameCube is innovative by Nintendo standards, none of its innovations actually quite work. Analog triggers were great, but they weren't widely utilized, and Nintendo has moved away from the concept for a long time. The minidisc format was swiftly abandoned, the handle and link cables didn't really get much use. What's remembered about the console is the immense quality of the game library, and that was largely facilitated by the technological improvements. Pikmin notably used hitherto undreamt of capacities to display many, many characters on screen at once. It is a great console that looks like it's revolutionary, but fundamentally, in every meaningful respect, I would argue the GameCube is actually just iterating on what was on the market at the time, and this is why I don't think it can go any higher. Number 10, Switch 2. Yes, I think I'm ready to place the newest kid on the block at this number. Although it's been getting a kicking by some who expected the next console to fly to the moon and make cheese toasters out of cereal boxes, Switch 2 is an iterative console to its bones, down to the number in the name. And yet, I think the Switch 2 does have quite a few tricks up its sleeve that make it on the upper end of the iterative consoles. First of all, mouse mode is another innovation like shoulder buttons that should have been obvious, and yet I can't think of a single person who called it, including me, who did a video on 50 technologies that Nintendo might include, including all sorts of weird and wonderful concepts. It is the perfect emblem of that Gunpei Yokoi aphorism, innovative thinking with seasoned technology. Drag and Drive may not be everybody's cup of tea, but it is a control scheme unlike any other I've seen before in games, and any system that can offer a genuinely brand new experience like this should get at least some credit for innovation. I also think we need to call out the chat feature. I know chat isn't new, and it isn't technically even new on Nintendo systems since they had the mobile app, but the ease of having a single button press take a game from solo to social is a step forward in ease and accessibility to social gaming, while there are clearly quite a few software innovations being used in the camera to make the whole system work. I did videos, which I'll link at the end, going through the developer interviews for both Switch 2 and Game Chat. It's clear that what they were aiming for wasn't necessarily to be the first or the most surprising with features this time out, but to implement them in the best way possible. And while we see how Game Chat functions and how the camera is utilized, I think they have at least put a distinctive Nintendo stamp on some old ideas in the same way that the GameCube did. But there are also some ideas that aren't quite new but are done in very different ways. Game Share seems like a powerful use of the system to system broadcasting, and magnets are a pretty cool way to make sure the Joy-Con attach and hopefully will prevent some of the issues that could plague older Joy-Con with them not fully clicking into place. And while USB ports are hardly revolutionary, the addition of a top-facing USB port whispers of huge potential innovation to come through the potential for add-ons. Switch 2 is arguably the last of the iterative consoles on this list, and yet I do think it offers just enough to draw level with and perhaps even nudge a little bit ahead of the GameCube. Still, let's plow on. Number 9, the NES. Surely the home console that started it all, the flagship of innovative consoles, deserves to be higher on this list. That it's not partly shows how crazy some of Nintendo's concepts have been, but also reflects the fact that cartridge-based home consoles were not entirely new as a concept. The Atari 2600 had previously tried this. However, surely the reason that the dear old Famicom needs to be held aloft as one of the greatest of all of Nintendo's innovative consoles is the arrival of the D-pad to the home market. The D-pad is a genius way to bring simple controls to a home market, replacing clunky old joysticks that instantly seemed comically out of date. And yet, what have I told you? That the D-pad too was not completely original. Oh, it was a Nintendo innovation, all right, a great one, but they had already used it on the Game & Watch. Specifically, the 1982 Donkey Kong game included the first Nintendo D-pad. Granted, it would be another year before the idea was popularized in the Famicom, and given that the Game & Watch systems were far less complicated and expensive to make at speed, it seems likely that this was always a piece of technology being trialed for the Famicom even then. Still, I think it does take just a bit of shine off the NES's claim to fame for piloting this groundbreaking control method that Nintendo had already used it. I freely admit it's unfair in many ways to rank this behemoth of a system so low, but I just question which of the machines ahead it would leapfrog. Let's take a look. Number 8, the Game Boy. Building on the Game & Watch that leveraged Gunpei Yokoi's eureka moment of seeing Japanese salarymen playing with a calculator into a series of dot matrix display handheld titles, the Game Boy was really the paragon of handheld gaming to that point. The concept of handheld gaming was basically defining Nintendo for most of the last 40 years. Far more than their home hardware, it's the handhelds which have tended to do better for longer, from the Game Boy to the DS to the Switch, so this was a very significant moment. Granted, this wasn't quite the first handheld. Mattel had dabbled in this market in the year before Game & Watch, and the Game & Watch itself really broke down the door. I had to think very hard before excluding Game & Watch from this list, and only did so because the consoles are one game per machine and not a true gaming platform. Still, in many ways, the Game Boy is an example less of innovation in its own right and more of perfecting innovations which had gone before. Game & Watch had already introduced dot matrix displays, D-pads, and there had even been prior attempts as far back as 1979 by other companies to have interchangeable cartridges in a handheld console. What the Game Boy did so well was to fuse all these concepts into the apex predator of the handheld space. Surviving for, depending on how you judge it, between 9.5 and 12 years, the Game Boy was a beast for games, with just enough power to be able to provide some truly iconic, rich experiences. But the single biggest innovation in the Game Boy, I would argue, isn't the screen or the buttons, but simply the battery life. The Sega Game Gear was far more powerful on paper, but a couple of hours and the batteries would run out. The Game Boy, though, that little tyke could run and run, and this made all the difference. It was not just theoretically portable, but practically useful for a long day out. It is very difficult to appreciate how significant a major landmark is after it becomes commonplace, and the Game Boy was a huge and fundamental shift in the way we play games, but I think it owes a lot of its power to really effective iteration on past ideas, and so judged on innovation alone, I'm going to move on to number 7, the Wii U. Okay, this seems like a mad placement because the Wii U is the very definition of Nintendo at its craziest. And yet, fundamentally, while the Wii U was weird and was certainly an example of Nintendo pushing the boat out, in certain respects it was leveraging concepts that had already been used by the company. Double screen gaming was not new to the manufacturer, they just never pulled it off significantly with home consoles before. Touch screens and microphones, these weren't new either. Even the concept of a tablet was pipped to the post by the sleeker looking iPad in 2010, meaning that by the time the chunky monster that controlled the Wii U dropped, it already felt more withered than seasoned as a technology. That said, there are things that feel new, especially the ability to broadcast the screen, and the syncing between the screen and the tablet were highly innovative and haven't really been matched today. The concept of asymmetrical gaming, with some people knowing more than others about the game they're playing, is another genius concept just waiting to be perfected. There's no doubt that the Wii U is an innovation powerhouse, but as mad as it got, I still don't think it's the wildest thing Nintendo has ever put out. Number 6. Nintendo 3DS. Here's the odd thing about it. In almost every respect, it is an iterative console. It's literally the DS, but a bit better, and for most of its life, that is, pragmatically speaking, how it was used by most people and most developers. But it had one feature that was then and remains now truly amazing to me in the form of glasses-free 3D. Like many of Nintendo's innovative concepts, it actually wasn't completely from their own ideas, but hijacked the huge trend for 3D. 3D films at the time were considered the new perfect way of watching films. When I opted, on purpose mind you, to ditch the daft glasses and watch a film at the cinema in a lowly 2 dimensions, I remember being looked at with suspicion. Why would anybody want a film in such an obviously inferior manner of presentation? The 3D wave seemed like it would last forever until suddenly it didn't, and it was gone, and there was still the 3DS. The technology is awesome, and I love Nintendo for doing it, and yet the things that really make the 3DS memorable are pretty much all the iterative elements the system offered. Nevertheless, that one major innovative aspect was so groundbreaking that the 3DS might have placed higher on this list if it weren't for number 5, Virtual Boy. Look, it was the 90s. Practically every television show with even mild genre elements, and several which didn't, included the obligatory episode where someone donned virtual reality goggles and was instantly floated into cyberworld, jacked into the mainframe. Nobody knew what a mainframe was and where these optical migraines of virtual reality land were set, but they were just symbols of the imminent VR future, until Nintendo decided to actually deliver that future in a way that only Nintendo could, as a dot matrix experience. I remember seeing the first advertisement for the Virtual Boy and being stunned. I remember rereading it and then rereading it, and then as weeks later passed, I reread it again. I couldn't quite take in how this thing would function, and apparently neither could anybody who actually played the thing because it clearly failed. But look, you can't get much bluer an ocean in the console space of the 90s than launching a VR handheld device. I think it was positioned like the DS and the Switch originally as a third pillar alongside their existing handheld offer. The difference is the DS and Switch soon proved that they could stand alone as Nintendo's premier console in the handheld space, while the Virtual Boy didn't. The system caused headaches and nausea and was just uncomfortable to play. But with the headset feature as the first 3D console, as a feat of innovation, as a line in the sand showing the determination Nintendo had then and still has, I would argue, to innovate, it is hard to top the iconic format of the Virtual Boy. Even when hardly anybody has played one, even decades since it released, it is still utterly iconic. And yet I think it's beaten out for innovation by number 4, Nintendo Switch. Perhaps nothing has ever been as stunningly innovative as HD Rumble. No, I'm kidding you. Of course, it's the hybrid form factor that takes this to such great heights. The Switch has become so commonplace that its wonders seem merely prosaic to us now. But that first time we saw the seamless transition from handheld to TV play without even breaking a sweat, an instant perfect switch, it did something that felt brand new. When the sides of the console unclipped and reformed into a traditional controller with the Joy-Con grip, or were clipped into straps to serve as Wii remotes, it felt like some kind of next level Transformers style ninjutsu. Little details like how the two controllers mirror each other so you can play two-player even on the go. The fact that you can use the world's flimsiest kickstand to play on your aeroplane stand if you can't be bothered to hold a console. The fact that you can literally lie in bed and have the Joy-Con hanging off the side of the bed and it still works. All these tiny, incredible little miracles were boiled into this one machine and structured around one indelible idea that is still carrying Nintendo forward all these years later. The Switch was special for more reasons than that, and I think it deserves a special credit for the way it incorporated so many previous successful innovations from touchscreen and motion controlled to, in its light form, the good old D-pad. Where it has to make choices to embrace simplicity and modernity, it does so. The use of USB-C felt incredibly forward thinking at the time. Ultimately, the console shows that innovation plus absolutely immaculate delivery is a powerful combination. But what could be more innovative than the Nintendo Switch? Number 3, Nintendo 64. I don't think these days the N64 is really recognised as a particularly innovative console. The games, of course, were hugely innovative, with Mario 64 and what we all called at the time Zelda 64, but is now more commonly and rightly remembered as Zelda Ocarina of Time, leading the way. Graphically, the console wasn't the first to use 3D polygonal graphics, but it was clearly a significant step forward from the Saturn and PlayStation in power terms, and took the distinctively un-Nintendo step, by the way we think of the company today, of literally naming the system after a tech specification. Granted, everybody sort of knew the terms 8-bit and 16-bit back in the day. Sega even plastered 16-bit on their boxes and had it in silver letters on their Mega Drive or Genesis machines. So proud were they of their hexadecimal bit count. But N64 was more than just about power. Polygonal 3D had been in arcades for a while, and Sega had dabbled with it even on the Mega Drive with the release of Virtua Racing, a game which required a specific chip, the Sega Virtua Processor, meaning that this single game retailed for $100 in the USA. The graphics, while impressive, were not the true source of the machine's innovation, but everything about the machine made the experience of gaming better in ways that seemed small but were hugely meaningful. Let's start with the basics. The Rumble Pack was a big departure from anything before in controllers, and yet is utterly standard now. 4 slots for people to play games at once. Before, 2 was the standard. If 3 people in your family wanted to play together at once, some kind of Mortal Kombat style deathmatch would need to ensue, or you needed to buy an add-on. It seems so obvious in retrospect that this was such an easy win for consoles, and yet Nintendo actually went with it. They also expanded the use of buttons at the back with the Z trigger and the range of colours, which was unprecedented in a home console, which normally stuck to muted monochrome shades. But the thing that really cuts the system loose is the analog trigger. Up until that point, a decade plus of gaming had been with the D-pad, a great innovation, but fundamentally limited. Suddenly, a control scheme allowed you to explore the world in 3D in a way that was utterly new. It wasn't some chunky old joystick, nor was it a 4 or even 8-part directional controller. There was something instantly magical and, well, revolutionary about controlling Mario 64 in this way. And here's the thing, I generally have barely mentioned the games here because for the most part, the games utilize the innovations but don't drive the innovations. But Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64 are really so deeply enmeshed, it's impossible to separate the genius of one from the genius of the other. There were 3D games before, or games which had some elements of 3D, even if they were fundamentally 2D, games like Bug and Crash Bandicoot. But Mario 64 was completely new and completely revolutionary as an experience, and it blew the doors off an industry. And yet, it's still not the most innovative of Nintendo's consoles. Number 2, the Wii. Ultimately, the mark of a great innovation is that it stands the test of time, and I suspect that every future console will show its strong Wii DNA going forward. There's not actually that much to say about the Wii because its one really simple idea was indisputably revolutionary. But there can only be one winner, and by now I think you've all figured out my nod for the most innovative Nintendo console of them all. Number 1, Nintendo DS. It started, the tale goes, as a final shot before retirement from Nintendo's president of 51 years, Hiroshi Yamauchi, making a console with 2 screens. Just having 2 different screens would be innovative in itself, enough to put it towards the upper end of this list, but I don't actually think that this even gets to half of the things that made the DS Nintendo's most innovative outing ever. Look at all the features it had: a touchscreen and stylus play. This was years before the 2007 debut of the iPhone, and although there were Palm Pilots that had similar features and did use styluses, this was a real departure for games. Also new for games, a microphone. A microphone is still pretty exciting in 2025 to see on Switch 2, but imagine how revolutionary that felt back in 2004. Then we need to talk about Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was very new. Most people under the age of 30 may never have even heard the bizarre and indelible sounds of dial-up connection, and yet these were still common in many places, even as the DS allowed Wi-Fi connected play. It's like Nintendo were pulling every single lever all at once in one console. Unlike Wii and Switch, it's not original for a single idea that is perfected in so many different ways. It is all innovation, all the time, with original games like Nintendogs and brain training, control schemes for games hitherto undreamt of. There have been a lot of incredible consoles, but I have to give it to the Nintendo DS. All that said, one final shout out to the Ghost of the Machine series that probably should top this list if it qualified. For the D-pad, for dot matrix, for handheld gaming on the go, let's at least acknowledge that almost all the innovations we enjoy today are downstream of that eternal classic, the Nintendo Game & Watch. So that's the list, and before we wrap up, a few thoughts on this exercise. Firstly, while the Switch 2 feels strongly iterative, and it is compared to many systems in the past, by this list the least innovative console in 2 decades, I think it deserves credit for the extent to which it still does try to tread new ground. I also think it's interesting to see the difference between those consoles like N64 and DS, where they were rethinking almost everything almost concurrently, and those like Switch and Wii, where one cohesive idea forced the reconfiguration of almost everything else. Finally, it has to be said that Nintendo has had far more iterative periods in the past, and after the absolute win that was the Nintendo Switch, the company can hardly be blamed for drilling down and trying to perfect what it had before trying to overturn the tea table with something completely new. I will return in another video to whether Nintendo is moving into a more iterative era or still retains its passion for innovation. And Switch 2 is a data point along the way, but I would caution against reading too much into it. Many thanks for watching. Huge thanks as ever to the channel's Patreon members, and do check out some past videos on the screen right now for more. I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.